values the way forward. Because we live in a predominantly liberal society, Western society, the ideology is liberalism, and if we're going to express ourselves in the context of law and values, then is and are liberal values the way forward? Well, what are the main propagated values? We have individualism and freedom. Let's define individualism. Is the belief in the primary importance of just the individual, the overemphasis that you are just an individual. Freedom, the definition of freedom, a right or the power to engage in certain actions without control or interference. But I ask you, brothers, sisters and friends, how is these values cohesive values? Are these values that are propagated in the economic and social and political structures in society that are very influential, how are they going to create a positive society? It's very simple. Garbage in, garbage out. And this is supported by Western social theory, which goes against the liberal view of society doesn't really matter, leave the individual to himself. But this goes against, one, intuition, two, academic evidence. And I'll discuss this. For example, Vivian Burr, a very famous social constructionist, she talks about a capitalist society. And she talks about how the individual affects society and the society affects the individual. It's not just about restriction on harm just on the specific individual. This is an incorrect perception of social realities. For example, what does she say? She says, for example, in a capitalist society, competition is fundamental. Society is structured around individuals and organizations that compete with each other for jobs, markets, etc. So that where competition is a fundamental feature of social and economic life, what we will get is competitive people. So if we turn that around for liberalism, if you propagate liberal values such as individualism and freedom, and then the influential values in society, then people are just going to be acting according to that. And this is supported by social research, which liberal politicians deny, because they want the individual to be sovereign. They don't care about society. And what does it say? Well, if you read a very basic textbook, for example, the one called Psychology, the Science of Mind and Behavior by Richard Ross, he says, social influence can be active or deliberate, as in persuasive communication and obedience, or passive or non-deliberate, as in social facilitation and conformity. A common feature of all social influence is the concept of the social norm. And there's two types, there's two models. There's a general consensus amongst social scientists. You have the informational influence and normative influence, which creates an internalization of those values or a compliance with those values. Hence, generally speaking, we can discuss this more in the Q&A, if you propagate in the influential structures of society non-cohesive values, you will get a non-cohesive society. And let's look at the fruits of liberal values. Alcohol misuse costs the NHS 1.7 billion each year. Over 6,000 die as a result. 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence. That's one domestic violence incident reported every minute to the police. There are over 100,000 drug offences in England and Wales. Over 12,000 rapes in 1 year, and that has increased by 8% since 2004. That's almost 3 rapes every 2 hours. The Metropolitan Police states that there was 167 murders in 2007 to 2008, which was up from 158. And you had UK liberal judges even saying this. Mr. Justice Coleridge comments on social breakdown. He says, on a scale, depth and breadth, which few of us could have even imagined a decade ago, it is a never-ending carnival of human misery, a ceaseless river of human distress. And I would argue that he's in the best place or best position to argue that. So I pose a question for the problem number 2. If the expression of an individual is restrained by law and society's values, and these values are damaging and harmful to society, then should they be referred to? Problem number 3, freedom to insult. The liberals have a big problem. They say freedom of speech goes hand in hand, freedom to insult, to degrade. However, I would argue that freedom to insult and to degrade actually goes against the very reasons why freedom of speech came about in the first place. To acquire truth, to account governments, and to facilitate progress. So there's a contradiction here. There is a paradox. The liberal lives in his bubble, and it's time to break that bubble. I'll give you an example. Premise number 1. Truth and progress develops via sincere debate and dialogue. Truth and progress can only be achieved by sincere debate and dialogue. Insults and degrading language do not facilitate debate and dialogue. Therefore, insults and degrading language should not be referred to because they go against the very reason of freedom of speech. Second premise, accountability requires good argumentation. If you want to say to Tony Blair that you're a really naughty boy for sending your boys in Iraq, we can't say that by swearing and arguing. We won't be taken seriously. So accountability requires good argumentation. However, insults and degrading language does not facilitate good argumentation. Therefore, insults and degrading language should not be referred to because they go against the very reasons why freedom of speech came about in the first place, which, to remind you, was truth, accountability, and progress. But the neoliberals forget their own tradition. We have to teach them their sunnah. The sunnah in Arabic means path. And for us, it's the way and the method of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For them, it's the method of Thomas Paine and John Stuart Mill. And what do they say? Actually contradicts to what Mr. Nikolai said. What does Mill say? He says, if done publicly are a violation of good manners and coming thus within the category of offences against others, may rightfully be prohibited. This is the founding father of freedom of speech. Of this kind are offences against decency. What does Thomas Paine say in The Rights of Man? He says, the law ought to prohibit only actions harmful to society. And if we look at our social norms, what we just discussed earlier, that these values harm society in a big way and there's that established academic link, then therefore we should have expression based upon liberal values. So the neoliberal tradition doesn't understand its own heritage. But one would argue, must we tolerate insults and degradation? It's not about tolerance. It's the matter of preventing harm to society. Because liberalism ignores the impact of the individual, what he says, to society itself. For example, Brendan O'Neill, who is the editor of Spiked, which is an anti-censorship website, he says, people are not attack dogs. They're not automatically become violent if they hear controversial things. Well, one may agree with that statement, but if those statements become predominant in society, then they become a social norm. And if they become a social norm, then they affect society in a big way because they don't facilitate truth, accountability, and progress. And this happened with the black people in America. It became a taboo to associate yourself with a black person. And that was predominant in society, and freedom of speech facilitated this. However, there was the absence of those values. So another question. If freedom to insult actually negates the objectives of freedom of speech, then shouldn't freedom to insult and degrade be restricted? Problem number four. They've got it the wrong way around, the neoliberals that is. Neoliberals say freedom of speech comes first, there's actually something good about it, then truth and progress and accountability are accidental positive byproducts. Intellectual excrement, if you like. So this means that freedom of speech intrinsically has value. For example, in the introduction to political theory, it says, what defines liberalism is the presumption that freedom is a good thing. But this is very funny. Generally, neoliberals, they're relativists. They don't believe anything has good value. For example, Nikolai, in his blog, which is called thebreadoflife.blogspot.com, which by the way, I couldn't access yesterday or the day before, so he's restricted his own speech. But I did 2 weeks ago.
Shut it down now.
He basically says, Holocaust was not wrong. Rape is not wrong. Murder is not wrong. Cannibalism is not wrong. Nothing is objectively wrong. So how can he say that freedom of speech intrinsically has a value? Freedom has a value. But you're a relativist, sir. How can you believe anything has a value? Philosophical contradiction, my friend. Problem number 5. Smoke screen. I'm not a smoker, but I think liberals are. And what they do, they use this smoke screen, they actually smoke freedom of speech because they use it as a smoke screen to attack Islam and religion. Because they can't have a positive debate and dialogue. They refuse to do so. Why do I say this? On many occasions I've invited big liberals and thinkers like Dawkins, etc. to have a frank debate with me, but they refuse. Danish cartoons by the newspaper Jyllands-Posten, they depicted the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as a terrorist, etc., which Western society claims they want to establish a good positive dialogue with the Muslims, but on the other hand, they just want to insult them and degrade them without any intellectual activity. But what does Danish law say? Section 140 of the Danish Criminal Code, it prevents people from ridiculing other people's beliefs. Section 22(6)(b) says any person who publicly or with the intention of wider dissemination makes a statement or imparts other information by which a group of people are threatened, insulted or degraded on account of their race, colour, national or ethnic origin, religion or sexual inclination shall be liable to a fine or to imprisonment for any term not exceeding 2 years. There's a law. The Danish government could have used this law as a mechanism to prevent the furore that happened, which they did 3 years before when it came to the cartoons of Jesus, salam, and other religious minorities. But when it comes to Islam, oh, we can't read anymore. We can't read our own laws. You see, it's a smokescreen to attack Islam and Muslims. And if you look at the history of this newspaper, Posten, in the 1920s and 30s, it was famous or infamous for its affinity to Italian and German fascism, to the point where it argued the case that Danish society should become a fascist society. We have another example, banning of the Qur'an. Lord Wilders, he's this right-wing politician that says we must ban the Qur'an, but I want freedom of speech. Oh, but you actually want to restrict speech, which is the Qur'an itself. So they basically, in contradiction, is full of paradoxes. They're not willing to engage in debate and dialogue. They're making a caricature of the Qur'an, which could be very dangerous in society, especially in this post-9/11 context. Now, I've left the vacuum now. We've just seen with these 5 problems, freedom of speech, there's some issues. And let me talk briefly about the Islamic model. But before I do so, let me talk about the liberals' blind assumption. The liberals' blind assumption is this, that you have to have freedom of speech. I know there's some flaws, but you have to have it in order to get truth, accountability, and progress. But this is as a result of their own historical baggage. And we have to sincerely feel sorry for them, because they have had a big historical headache. Because someone got the God stick and was banging the God stick. I.e., when I was discussing before, the Catholic Church was oppressing the intellectuals and the thinkers in Western society, European society. But this is a blind assumption. What they do is they get their historical narrative, things that they experienced, and they superimpose it on everything else, including Islam and the Muslims. This is unfair. This is very unfair. Let me give you something about the Islamic model. Well, the Islamic model is realistic. It understands freedom of speech does not exist and cannot exist, but it is expression within the context of law and society's values. But the objectives are met, and we see unprecedented in history that truth, accountability, and progress are things that the West looked at Islam in history in order to follow suit. But yet, they were couched in cohesive values of respect, honor, and dignity. And let me just talk about some of the source texts, i.e. the Qur'an and the Hadith, that make the philosophy of Islam with regards to this model. The Qur'an says, and do not mix up the truth with the falsehood, nor hide the truth while you know it, and enjoin on each other truth. وَتَوَصَّوْا بِالْحَقِّ. Do they not examine the realm of the heavens and the earth, and whatever God has created? And he continues, O mankind, we created you from a male and a female, made you into different tribes and nations, in order to know one another, facilitating truth and dialogue and knowledge here. And he continues, and he talks about blind thinking. When it is said to them, follow what God has revealed, they say, no, we follow the ways of our fathers. What? Even though their fathers understood nothing? Accountability. There's a famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him. He said, the greatest jihad is a word of truth to a tyrant ruler. Accountability here. And the Qur'an resonates this. Let there be among you people that command the good, enjoying what is right and forbid what is wrong. Commanding the ma'ruf, forbidding the munkar. They are indeed the successful ones. And it's quite funny. Islam doesn't give the option for people to be accountable. It gives them the obligation for people to be accountable. Progress. I'll quote 2 famous historians of science to show that when the liberals, or before they became liberals, they didn't even know how to sign their own names. I'll give you some of these quotes in that history. John William Draper, in the Intellectual Development of Europe, he says, I have to deplore the systematic manner in which the literature of Europe has continued to put out of sight our obligations to the Mohammedans. Surely they cannot be much longer hidden. Injustice, founded on religious rancor and national conceit, cannot be perpetuated forever. The Arab has left his intellectual imprint on Europe. He has indelibly written it on the heavens, as any one may see who reads the names of the stars on a common celestial globe. Robert Ruffo, he says in The Making of Humanity, for although there is not a single aspect of European growth in which the decisive influence of Islamic culture is not traceable, nowhere it is so clear and momentous as in the genesis of that power which constitutes the permanent distinctive force of the modern world and the supreme source of its victory, natural science and scientific spirit. But the acquisition of truth, accountability and progress sits within respect, honor and dignity, values that we all share. The Qur'an says, and they shall enjoy honor and dignity. O believers, let not people ridicule other people, nor insult one another. Spy not and defame not others. God does not love the public utterance of evil speech. Now, British society wants this model. Everyone's heard about Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross. We had over 20,000 complaints to BBC because they were, I don't even want to repeat what they were saying, to a 78-year-old man. British society has had enough of insults without intellectual debate. They've had enough of slander, and so have we. But lessons need to be made, and what are these lessons? Very few people look at the underlying values in society that has elevated these presenters to levels of stars, and similar behavior that is now common currency of modern culture in the West. No one makes a link between these values and the fruits of these values. People complain about the symptoms, but they forget about the cause. You choose, brothers, sisters and friends. A model that is logically incoherent, doesn't make sense, full of contradictions, and a society full of people insulting and degrading each other, or a model that has the intellectual and moral foundations to acquire truth, accountability and progress, yet manages to promote, adhere to respect, honor and dignity. Now the summary of my argument is as follows. Freedom of speech does not exist, therefore the liberals' arguments are redundant. Liberal values actually harm society, therefore liberal values must not be propagated, and speech based on these values must not be propagated either. Freedom to insult and degrading speech contradicts the objectives of freedom of speech. Therefore, freedom to insult and degrading language must be restricted. Otherwise, you're in a paradox. And no one can claim that there's something intrinsically good about freedom, especially the liberals, because they don't believe there's anything good intrinsically about anything, because they are relativists, as we quoted some of his blog. But I'm sure if you were to go into it from tomorrow, it won't be there anymore. Has freedom of speech gone too far? Well, there is no freedom of speech, but liberal values, freedom to insult and degrade, has indeed gone too far. Significantly, they have damaged society. The final say. Who has the final say in Islamic tradition? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says in Qur'an chapter 14, verse 24 to 26, do you not see how God sets forth a parable? A good word is like a good tree, whose root is firmly fixed and its branches reach to the heavens. It brings forth its fruit at all times by the leave of its Lord. So God sets forth parables for mankind in order that they may receive admonition. And the parable of an evil word is that of an evil tree. It is torn up by the root from the surface of the earth. It has no stability. In contemporary terms, this evil word, I believe, is liberal values, which expression in society is based upon these values, and we've seen the fruits of these values, and we've seen the destruction of these values. I'd like to end. There are probably many teachers in this room. I know my sister's a teacher, and other people here are teachers. Now imagine if you applied the freedom of speech principle in our classrooms. Hey miss, beep, beep, beep. Hey man, beep, beep, beep. All these swear words. Imagine we allowed this to accumulate, yeah? And the kid said, it's fine, I want to be insulted that way. I don't really consider it as something bad, but some kids do. Imagine that was propagated in schools. Imagine. And then they grew up and they became leaders in our society. And what would you expect to happen? So there's restrictions in the classroom, surely. Nikolai has a son. Many other people in here have children. And we'll never apply this freedom of speech when we bring up our own children. However, I'd like to end that this is not the final argument. Obviously, it's going to be a very interesting Q&A, because Nikolai is very intelligent. MashaAllah. And I'd like to end that anything that I have said that is negative or wrong or even offensive has come from shaitan and my nafs, my ego. Anything that I said that's positive and good has indeed unquestionably come from God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jazakallah for listening. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.